Welcome to From Guilt to Good, Self-Care Solutions for Busy Caregivers, the podcast rewriting the narrative of self-care. If you're a caregiver feeling stretched thin, torn between responsibilities, and longing for self-care, you're in the right place. I'm Jeanette Yates, a fellow caregiver and someone who has spent years doing all the self-care things and never feeling any better. After years of research, trial and error, and some really deep exploration, I finally found a way to create a sustainable self-care practice that made me feel good, not guilty. And in From Guilt to Good, we'll explore how you can do that too. Together, we'll hear expert insights, actionable steps, and heartfelt stories to guide you toward rediscovering your worth, reclaiming your health, and getting back the life you've been too busy to enjoy. And you guys, today I am interviewing fellow caregiver Rebecca Sugar. Rebecca learned how to be a family caregiver on the job, taking responsibility for her elderly father through multiple spinal cord surgeries at the age of 79. She's also an established author and journalist, writing the column The Cocktail Party Contrarian, which appears in the New York Sun every other Friday. Her work has also been published in the Wall Street Journal, Washington Examiner, USA Today, Spectator USA, Jewish News Syndicate, The Christian Post, The Jewish Journal, and more. She holds a BA in literature from the University of Pennsylvania and a master's degree in history from Jewish Theological Seminary. She lives in New York City. And before we hop over to this interview, I just want to let you know that this conversation is really is a little bit different than some of the other things that we talk about. We do talk about self-care and some coping skills, she has a high-low strategy you should listen for that's really good. But really, it's about her experience as a caregiver. And like me, she's a long-term caregiver. So it's really insightful. And then, of course, I also want to make sure that you listen towards the end because she talks about her new book that has come out called Everything's a Little Broken. It is a novel based a little bit loosely on her experience as a caregiver. She talks a little bit about why she chose to write that way and how it has been part of her caregiving journey as well. So without further ado, let's welcome Rebecca Sugar. Welcome, Rebecca, to the podcast. It's so good to have you here.
So excited to be here. Thank you.
All right. So we have a lot to talk about today. Your bio we could have a whole conversation just about your journalism career because that sounds fascinating, but that's for another podcast. Today, we're talking about caregiving and resilience and humor and getting through all of it. But I always ask my guests to share any caregiving experience they have. So I'd love to hear just, a small piece of your caregiving story. How are you a caregiver? All of this.
Right. So my father is 83 and he has been in sort of a state of physical decline actually since he's 40 years old. He had a spinal surgery when he was 43 years ago. And he had an injury caused by a chiropractor, sadly. So it was just a bad accident and he was being paralyzed by it. The surgery, thankfully, saved him from paralysis, which is the most important thing. But 43 years ago, spinal surgery was a little bit more crude than it is today. And it left him with a series of issues, chronic pain, atrophy, inability to exercise, do all sorts of things. So over time, it got worse and worse, as it would. And then with age, as he really moved into his older years, everything compounded and got even worse to the point where now he's, physically, we like to call him a wreck. He's almost immobile. He's too proud to put himself in a wheelchair, but it's where he's belonged for a very long time. Until a few years ago, he's walking with a cane, which was absurd. There was no protection there at all. He really belongs actually in a wheelchair. So he's very physically limited and cognitively 1,000%, thankfully. But so I'm not physically taking care of him physically every day, let's say. He has somebody to help with that. I mean, I couldn't lift him. I couldn't, stuff like that. But emotionally and mentally and just, being there on that level, I feel very much like his caregiver, maybe his primary one. He and I have always been very close.
I love that you're saying this right now for many reasons. First of all, my mother has also been in a state of decline and disability since 1984. So I've been a caregiver most of my life. So the 40
Wow.
years is,
Yeah.
I'm like, yep, right there with you. And the
Yeah.
idea of the physical debilitation, but not the mental, not the cognitive, and how hard that is for them, but also as a caregiver, it's very difficult to try to manage that and allow them to have autonomy and individuality and independence as much as
Yeah.
possible, but also like,
Yeah.
stop doing that, it's dangerous. That idea. And then
That's
secondly, well, go ahead, and then I'll say something else. Go ahead.
you just set off everything, right? I mean, it's just the truth is it's a balance between, especially for someone like my dad, who is such a proud and stubborn human being. Everything is an attack on his dignity. And so everything I do for him is sort of in that frame of mind of how do I help him maintain his dignity in these
Right.
unbelievably undignified moments. That is so key
Right.
to keeping him going and keeping him alive and happy, and with all these limitations, right? And at the same time, as you say, there are times when you just have to come down at like Stalin and just be like, get in the wheelchair for God's sake,
Right.
or whatever you have to do to kind of don't try and lift that. You can't,
Yes.
but you want to say that as little as possible, because
Yes.
the fight, the spirit, the resistance, and the maintaining of the dignity is part of what keeps them going, and right? So it's always a dance
Yes.
between the two.
That is so funny, because like my mom is like, I'm not giving up. I'm not giving up. And I'm like, no, I don't want,
Right.
I'm not, that's not what I'm saying. But also, you haven't been able to walk in 3 years. So stop trying to walk.
Yeah.
Like literally that's
Right.
what we deal with on a regular basis. But I also really appreciated that you said you're not in the day to day doing the, getting him dressed and fixing the meals and all that kind of stuff, but you still feel like his primary caregiver, because it's that emotional component and connection and
Yeah.
all of that is, and a lot of people that, I'm like, you're a caregiver. They don't know it, because they're like, oh, well,
Right.
I don't have to do all that. They're fine. They don't. And I'm like, if you're helping somebody emotionally through their chronic illnesses and diseases and conditions, you're a caregiver. It may not look like what you think it's supposed to, but can you talk a little bit more about that and how that is a full-time job essentially?
Yeah. Yeah. Look, it is, because one of the big things that I've learned, I'm still learning it, it's very hard to learn, is that you can't fix everything. You can't even fix most things, certainly not about other people. So my dad's physical condition is not getting better ever. That I've learned. It is
Same.
not something I can control. It is not something I can manage. He's like 6 feet tall and, big guy. And what am I going to do? Help him like get out of a chair? I'm, 5'4", I'm a little, like just actually logistically, there's very limited
Right.
amount of stuff that I can physically do. And so that's hard to accept, right? And that's how we think of caregiving, as like doing this or doing that. And then what I've learned over time is, having your mind completely intact and being trapped in a body that betrays you is a horrible way to live.
Yes.
And you become emotionally. My father's actually, by the way, I just should always say this. I've never met a stronger human being, and given what he has been through and the limitations on his life, he's really not a depressed kind of down guy. He runs a business still, mostly from home. He's still very active and alive and energetic, but it weighs on you emotionally. And I find that that energy that I give him, just bantering with him and laughing, or just talking to him as though he's not sitting there in excruciating pain, trying to rub his leg without anybody noticing, or whatever the thing is in that moment, it just restores something in him. And he needs that. That is the kind of care that he actually needs, that I can give him. And then there are really like serious moments, and they're awful, right? There was a moment not so long ago, a couple months ago, when he was in the hospital, again, because of some other issue that happened to him, and they had to medicate him on some medicine that was very strong, and it dehydrated him tremendously, and he kind of got a little confused, which is not him at all. And I live about an hour away, and I had to jump in the car in the morning and go to the hospital, because he wasn't clear that he was going to be let out of the hospital. He was scared. And everybody was telling him, what do you mean? We're letting you out. It's fine. But mine was the only voice that penetrated the fog. And he trusted me and believed me. And that in that moment, I was like the most important caregiver. He had a million nurses in the hospital around him taking care of his physical needs. But I was caring for his soul and his spirit and his emotional state. And I think that's critical, right?
Yes. And I also like everything you're saying, I'm like, oh my goodness, we've been right there. Yep, 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 yep. Like if people are watching this on the video, it's like Jeanette's head is bobbing up and down like a bobblehead. Because a lot of times we can't do anything to help them physically. Like we cannot physically do it, logistically do it. There's all these reasons. And so we do have, what's left is, well, let's just, be present, keep reminding them that we are here. And you also talk about and I can tell you're just kind of a funny person in general, but you also talk a little bit about like having humor, even in like all of the dark, deep experiences. And like you said, this is a long-term thing. It's not getting any better. Can you talk a little bit about how humor and acceptance gets you through all of this long-term caregiving role?
Humor is, that's my dad too. That's how he sort of relates to things. So we kind of banter as kind of thing. We kind of tease each other and laugh about things that are not really funny at all. But in the end, I just sort of start with, everything's a little funny, right? Because the human condition is absurd, right? We're all fragile and frail people. Once upon a time, my dad was this strong, strapping man. Couldn't have imagined that one day he'd be in this state. I'm 53. Sometimes I get out of a chair. My back hurts a little. We are all the most powerful among us. It's just human, and we're all frail in that way. And life is absurd. So it's not belly laugh funny, but it's kind of, if you can't look at people and their weaknesses and kind of understand that we're all ridiculous, then I think you're missing the joke. In my dad's case, you can't miss the joke. It's very obvious and overt. But we like in every way. Every birthday I buy him gifts. Like he came out of his second spinal surgery a couple of years ago, and lucky him, he's one of like the 15 or 20% of people who come out of that particular surgery with lack of mobility in their arms for a few days. And then for a few months, he had to build it back. So he almost couldn't move when he came out. It's not funny at all, although I'm laughing. But I laughed and I'm like, you are the exception to every rule. Look at you. Right. You even beat the odds on this one. And you got, that problem on top of everything else. Or birthdays, his birthday that year, I bought him a bib that said something about being old because his hands didn't work very well. All the food was always falling on his shirt and getting him dirty. And no, it's not funny that he needs a bib, but he laughed because it's ridiculous that he needs a bib.
Yes.
So he doesn't need it anymore, thankfully. But that's how we use humor, because it also allows you to face the thing directly. I think a lot of people avoid the sad thing. They don't want to talk about it because it's so awful and sad. And that, I think, is not, at least in my dad's case, he needed someone to recognize that this was happening and it's terrible. Yeah.
Like, am I the only one that thinks this is ridiculous?
Right. You don't want to ignore it, I think. That just makes the person feel more isolated and awkward.
Right.
At least with us, that's how we, do it.
That your story of the bib reminded me, my mom's condition also weakens all of her muscles. And when decades ago, when I was still a teenager at home, I would go to her support groups with her. And there was one guy there, and he was so funny. He used humor too. And he would say, I always just wear plain t-shirts. That way, when I get stuff on the front, I just switch it around and wear like the back of the shirt in the front. And of course he didn't really do that, but he was like, that's what I do. And so I do think that's, having humor helps a lot. You said everything's a little funny, which reminds me, sounds familiar. There's a book out. You wrote a book called Everything's a Little Broken. And we were talking a little bit before I hit record. In my head, it was a memoir about your experience, but really, no, you use this book as a fictionalized account of a caregiving situation. And so I really want to talk about your book, which at the time of this recording has just been out for 3 days. How exciting is that?
Very exciting, very
Yes.
strange. Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about the book. What made you want to write it, and then go in a little bit and tell about what's going on in there. What's going
Yeah,
on in that
thank you.
book?
So um, my book, I I didn't even know I was writing a book, to tell you the truth. I write columns, and
Mm-hmm.
I write for people who sort of restrict your word count to like 450. So
Yes.
books, it's a
Could never
whole
do
other
that, but
animal. But it was COVID. Yeah, it was COVID, and there I was, and what else was I doing but writing and cooking meals for my kids. And so I think the first 30 pages just kind of flew out of me, and it was not a book at all. I think it was just what people do. They just write what they're thinking, and a
mm-hmm.
lot of stuff was going on with my dad at that moment, and so it just came out. Nothing else came out for months and months, and then one day I woke up at like 3 in the morning and sat down at the computer, and everything, the rest of it came out. It's
Mm.
largely the three main characters are autobiographical to a large degree. It's me, my father, and then there's an older woman in the book who was a real person who was actually his nanny growing up, and then
Oh,
was mine as well. So she was in our family for
that's
70
awesome.
years, and we adored her. And she's been gone for 20 something years, but I just like brought her back. And in some ways, that's why I made it a fiction novel, so that I could play around with reality. And then I have all the other characters who are sort of amalgams of different people.
Mm-hmm.
And also, fiction allows you to kind of go back and semi-correct things maybe that you didn't
Oh,
get to
yeah.
do in real life. Like as an example, that woman, her name is May in the book, and the dad character is Matt. But in real life, Ella, who is May, and my father, um, the last years of Ella's life, they didn't see each other physically because my dad was already in a bad condition. He couldn't walk up the 3 flights to her apartment in Brooklyn. She couldn't
Mm,
get down, and there was no Zoom, and there was none of this.
right. Oh,
So they only spoke on the phone. And I always was so sad. I always regretted. I don't even think back then, if I'm remembering, that like camera phones and videos were a thing. So they didn't really see each other. And I hated that for them. They really were bonded. They loved each other. So in the book, I have them talk on like FaceTime or Zoom or something in the last
oh,
days of her life. It's great for that. You get to kind of mess around with reality and make it the way you think it should have been if God had been paying attention better. Um, so but the book is called Everything's a Little Broken for obvious reasons, right? Meaning, sometimes everything's a lot broken, but most of the time everything's a little broken. We're all a little broken. My dad clearly has been a little broken for a long time. And yet, there's some great Leonard Cohen poem
yes.
that he wrote called Anthem. And I'm going to botch it, so I apologize. But it was something like, ring the bells that still can ring. There's a crack in everything.
Yes.
No, sorry. Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. So it's something
Yes.
like that, and I'm sure I've not done
No,
it
I
justice.
think
But
that's
so
right because
that's
I
sort
went
of,
and listened to it this morning.
oh, okay, great.
Yeah.
I really have to memorize that. Yeah, so this idea playing around with that, everything's a little broken. And when you're caretaking, I don't know if this happens to you, but it affects obviously your relationships with everybody, with your siblings if you have them, with your other parent, with your children, with your friends. I mean, my friends are all talking about this now because we're all of this age.
Yeah.
Um, and and everything's a little broken. Sometimes your siblings step up and do amazing things. Sometimes they don't.
Yeah.
Sometimes you do a lot and you become the designated doer, and everybody loves that you're the designated doer and
Right.
says, call me if you need anything. Um, so like there are a lot of things that go on in the mix that are a little bit broken, but at the end, I just sort of find, and I think the book is sort of trying to deal with this, that um, there are no answers, there's no end, there's no ending,
Mm-mm.
there's no happy ending, there's no bow at the end, but you discover a lot along the way. And even though everything's a little broken, there's still a lot to gain and learn and grow from. And I don't mean to make it sound like happy and chippy, but I don't also want it to be depressing and terrible. It's neither. It's
Right.
it's a little
It
bit of
is.
both,
It is.
right?
We don't have to have
Yeah.
the perfect everything sunshine and roses or the worst thing. It is, I hate to say it like this, but it is what it is. And
Both.
we can experience it in
Yeah.
a more open way, I think, when we approach it that way and just know that, you know, everything is a little broken, but it's also okay, Um, whenever I think about the word
Yeah.
broken, I always think of the letters in the center are okay. And so it's a little reminder for
Do
me.
you know that I've never thought of that until you just said it, and I'm going to steal that and use it.
Please do.
Thank you.
Please do. So one of the things that you've mentioned is like the dynamics between other family members, and you mentioned that you have children. How did you navigate that, especially during the pandemic when you weren't able to, everything was a lot broken. We were all stuck. How did you navigate caregiving and being a part of your dad's experience? Because I'm sure, like you said, it was really complicated, and you have your kids at home. Can you talk a little bit about that, or is this a curveball? You're like, no.
Yeah. No. I'm happy to talk about it. I'm just shaking my head because I'm thinking like all the people who've dealt with this and what happened in this country and how it's, I have to say we had it better than most, right?
Yeah.
I had a friend whose mother was in an old age home, and and luckily she did not die in the old age home, but she didn't physically see or touch her mother for years. I mean, there were horror stories. Thankfully, we were both, my parents and I were both living at that time very close to each other, like 5-10 minutes away in a suburb. So we would go see them all the time. We would sit outside at first, and then at a point I just sort of said, enough of this, like we're not doing this, and we just sort of hang out together. And also, luckily for me, my children were in that sweet spot. I have nothing to complain about. They were like in 8th grade-ish. So they were old enough to do Zoom school without my sitting there with them all day long, like a lot of my friends with little kids.
Gotcha.
And they were young enough to not be teenagers who were, screaming that they couldn't see their friends. They were kind of happy to be with us still. So lucky me, I didn't have a lot to worry about with them, but that's just pure luck. But yeah, I was with my dad and my mom all the time. And thank goodness I was, right? Because that kind of isolation in the midst of that was deadly for people. Honestly, if they didn't physically die, their souls were dying, and I can't imagine that I could have like left them to zoomed with them for 2 years. I don't know how people did it. I give them so much credit to having made it through, but I did not have it that hard actually.
Yeah,
compared to most.
I think like we've talked about a little bit, we all can look back now, and we collectively as a world, like as it basically impacted everybody, we did develop resilience in some ways. And, and I think as caregivers, we can take that through with us, even in our day-to-day now, that we are going to have, there is isolation in caregiving. There is isolation for the person who needs the care at some point, like it happens to everyone, and how to continue to be able to process that, handle it with grace and with humor, I think is very important. I also wanted to ask you though, is there any, did you develop any healthy coping skills? That I'm laughing because, we all develop coping skills, sometimes not the greatest ones. But were there any specific things that you did or that you continue to do? Because like you said, it's not over. We're still caregiving right now. How do we, what are some things that you have done to help you process those emotions or cope with that roller coaster that we ride as caregivers?
Yeah. I always think of this in terms of like high-low, like high-low dressing where you wear like a really fancy bag and like your shirt from the Gap.
Yeah.
Feels like how I deal with coping mechanisms for caregiving. There's high-low. So like the high for me was high, meaning I went deep on like faith. For me, I grew up in a Jewish home, a relatively traditional one, but I had my issues with even just the word and like how to feel about faith when things collapse around you. Everybody feels this way at some point, I think, if you're thinking about it. Even if you're not religious per se, it's a faith issue. So, and May in the book and Ella in real life was a very devout Pentecostal Christian. And she had the most beautiful, anchored, unyielding sense of faith. Nothing penetrated it. And she had a lot of reason to lose her faith. She didn't have an easy life. And so Mira in the book is always trying to kind of glom on to May's deep, abiding Christian faith and try to like kind of resurrect her own. And that's really reflective of my life. I was in that moment, like really reading a lot and listening to podcasts and doing all sorts of things to try and re-explore my Jewish faith.
Yes.
And that's just the language Jewish that, that I use for my faith, but really they're all anchored in much of the same thing. And I just would think about the things that Ella, the scripture she used to quote to me from Old Testament and New Testament. I would listen to gospel music, which I still love to this day because of her. And, so you do all that kind of stuff. That's the high. And then there's the low. And there, I just think when you're a caretaker, short of anything dangerous, I don't really, I don't have any like real vices, unfortunately. I always thought it would be great to drink because it's such a good, like my girlfriends who were drinking lots of rosé during COVID, they seemed much happier than I was. It's a great like parenting skill maybe or strategy, but I just never liked it that much. Chocolate, like you go low. Anything that you can do to give yourself the energy, like literally bars of chocolate, and also like bad TV. God, I fell in love with Outlander. I'm so embarrassed to say.
That's one of my
really
mom's
bad
favorites.
TV, but it made me happy. It's like that Scottish accent just made me happy.
Yeah.
Anything that just made me happy, I left the guilt at the door and just said, like I need this. So it was like that. And I just sort of feel like I hope that I kind of still try to practice that now. The low, I call it low stuff, but it's useful stuff. It's not that it's bad.
I love it. You can have my okay in the middle of broken, and I'm going to take high low because I like that. Like, yes, we can, there's always going to be something, whether it's going deeper into your spirituality or, like I'm really getting into, I'm doing a lot of mindfulness and breath work and yoga and things like that right now. And I'm doing all that, but you're right. Yeah. I also, here's my low. And if the authors happen to listen to this, know that I am no way saying that your books are low bar in any way. They are my favorite audiobooks to listen to. There is a series of British mysteries written by 2 authors. One is from America, one is from the UK. They collaborate on these books. There's like 40 of them, and they're little cozy mysteries. A single mom living in the Cotswolds and a retired NYPD cop also living in the Cotswolds solve mysteries. So it's like a little bit of like, somebody dies, but it's not scary. And that's my thing. Yeah. It's Cheering Him series by Matthew Costello and Neil Richards. Just I'm throwing that out there. I love, and I also talk to them on Twitter all the time, which is fantastic. But that's my low. But like as far as like my easy, it's just there's something about the narrator that they have narrating all these books. I can listen to them all day. I've listened to all of them multiple times. So that's my like. I'm just like, leave me alone. I'm listening to my Cheering Him series books. For sure.
It's low but high, right?
Yes.
Because if it gives you that much pleasure and value, then it's high. So it sort of bounces back and forth, maybe.
Very much so. Very much so. There's no low. It's all high. But I love, like you said, just if it brings you joy, if it calms you down, if it makes you smile, that's a good coping skill. Try not to hurt yourself. Yeah. Please be safe. Right.
Love is key.
Yeah.
So, and my dog. I have to mention my dog.
Yeah.
My dog. Everybody should have a dog.
Yes.
Is my other recommendation. Like nothing actually grounds you and makes you feel better than rolling around on the floor with your 67-pound, fat, squishy English bulldog who doesn't know what's going on in your life. And so when you're at your like most sensitive, crazed moment and you're sitting there, you don't know what you're going to do, and he just walks over, looks at you, climbs onto your leg and starts humping it, you just think, this is so like, this is what it's meant to be. Like, it just makes you laugh and it reminds you that it's not that deep and like everything will be okay. And like life goes on and your dog still just thinks of you as a leg to hump. Like it's all about my dog.
That is so true. That is so true. Having one of my clients that's a caregiver, she said that one of the ways she meditates is brushing her dog because it's just like so calming and the dog will just stay there. And it's like, I've discovered I thought I didn't meditate, but I do. Because it's
literally,
just
that's right. That's
yeah.
meditation. Yeah.
Rebecca, this has been a great conversation. I do want to make sure people know where to get your book. Everything is a little broken. Can you let us know how they can get in touch with you, how they can get the book? What do we need to know?
Yes. So it's available right now on Amazon and barnesandnoble.com. And I have a website, RebeccaSugarOnline.com, where you can read all my articles and a little bit about the book. And I just want to say, first of all, thank you to you. And I almost want to interview you and hear your story about your mom. I'm intrigued now. And thanks to everyone who would read the book. And what I love the most about writing is when people tell me what they think, good or bad, actually, but better good. And I really hope if any of your viewers or your listeners decide to read the book, that they'll take just a second to just write to me and just tell me what they thought. Tell me any little part of it that mattered to them. That's the best reward when you write something.
Well, I am going to encourage them to do that too. And you guys, I also want you to make sure that you check the show notes. Of course, we always have our self-care resources there. I will also link Rebecca's site so that you can get the book. And I am also doing a little giveaway, and I'm going to have the instructions on how to sign up for the giveaway in the show notes. I'm still working that out with the publishing company, but we're going to do that for you so that we can give one of your books away to one of our listeners. And I'm so excited about that. But thank you so much for joining me. And yeah, we'll have to talk again soon. Next book. I know you're writing another one already, probably.
Love it. I would love to.
If you're an overwhelmed caregiver that longs for some of your life back, craves time for self-care, freedom from the isolation of caregiving and the guilt, then the Empowered Self-Caregiver Cohort is for you. Within the Empowered Self-Caregiver Cohort, we'll take a deeper look into your unique caregiving challenges, assess your current self-care practices, and explore a personalized plan where you feel your self-care focus is most necessary. You'll design a self-care practice that is flexible enough for your life and something that you're going to actually enjoy. Erase your guilt, embrace a sense of worthiness and empowerment, and create an unshakable support system to avoid a lonely caregiving journey. In the Empowered Self-Caregiver Cohort, I share the very steps I took to break the burnout cycle of self-care. As someone who has been a caregiver for over 2 decades, I know what it's like and I know what it takes to finally find balance, and my care framework inside the cohort teaches you to find that balance too. If you're interested in learning more about the Self-Caregiver Cohort, please go to theselfcaregiver.com or check the show description for details. Thank you for joining me today. From Guilt to Good podcast is a proud member of the Whole Care Podcast Network. To access additional self-care resources to help you feel good, not guilty, check out the show notes or the description below. You'll also find the way to enter the book giveaway that we're doing for Rebecca Sugar's new book, Everything's a Little Broken. Subscribe now and join me in going from guilt to good as you rediscover your worth, reclaim your health, and get back the life you've been too busy to enjoy. And if you've enjoyed this show, please take a moment to leave us a review. Your feedback matters. We're redefining self-care for caregivers, one episode at a time. And until next time, remember, you are worthy of the same care you give others.